And with that, I'm Heather Flanagan. I'm currently wearing the hat of Technical Liaison for Seamless Access. And but that's just one of the things that I do. I also work with the R&E Federation community as a coordinator for refeds. I work with ID Pro, which is a professional organization for identity and access management practitioners. And I spend a lot of time working with browser vendors, with identity providers, et cetera, on this whole question of web browsers and privacy, and on the very, very macro scale. And it's that perspective of all the different IAM threads that I get to pull together that I'm bringing to you today. So it's going to be somewhat of a technical talk, but not too technical, I hope. And I hope you folks can follow along. We're going to start a little bit about the problem statement from the perspective of browsers and federated identity. We're going to talk a little bit about what tracking looks like on the web, how it happens. We're going to talk about, there are changes underway. So what does that mean for us, and when does it mean things are going to happen? And then we can talk a little bit about next steps, because one thing, if you take away nothing else from today, know that changes are absolutely in progress, but the real gory details are still being determined. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the space, not just for you in your roles, but just for the World Wide Web in general. So your site, if you're here, you're probably someone who's been using federated identity to authenticate to a site. Your site is probably using SAML, or it might be using OpenID Connect, or it might be doing both. If you're primarily in academia, then you're primarily in the SAML space. But if you do anything with social identity providers like Google or Facebook, then you're using OpenID Connect. Now, as browsers take steps to support user privacy because they are under a lot of pressure to do so, they're deprecating certain features, such as third-party cookies, bounce tracking, link decoration. And I'm going to just define all those things as part of the slides today. But the trick is, those are like bricks for a house, right? They, in and of themselves, they're neutral things. They're just a piece of functionality. And it's how they're being used that has turned into an interesting challenge, because many of those pieces of functionality are also used by other things like federated identity. So you've got trackers using third-party cookies, but you also have certain aspects of federated identity using third-party cookies. It's an interesting problem. So the short version, summarizing everything in this slide deck right to start. What's going to break? Okay, authentication that uses SAML will continue to work for at least the next 2 to 3 years, with one major exception in terms of functionality, and that's the ability to globally log out of all SAML sessions. Now, to be fair, implementing single logout, which is what that's called, is really hard, and not many sites do it well to begin with. Still, as a piece of functionality, it's the biggest thing that's under threat with SAML right now. Now, coming into the more social identity provider components, authentication that uses OIDC, which is OpenID Connect, is going to at least partly break, which is, since social identity is probably the single most pervasive use of federated identity on the web, that's going to be a character building experience for many who depend on it. Now, services like Seamless Access, which many of you are familiar with as a component in the federated authentication workflow that enables IDP discovery. So services like that use the browser local storage to store a piece of data so that other domains can read it and act on it, you're going to have some mixed results there in terms of, does the functionality remain the same? Will changes have to happen? Will things partly break? Probably. Now, I obviously coming as a technical liaison of seamless access, that's pretty important to me. But for the publishers on the call, this is also an impact if you are a publisher that has a variety of domains that use a common single sign-on service. You might have problems depending on exactly how you enable that service. So, okay, the general problem statement here. Non-transparent, uncontrollable tracking of users across the web needs to be addressed and prevented. This was where we got to during a workshop called the Federation and Browser Workshop held at the end of May. I coordinated that workshop and we had about 80 or 90 attendees, I think, from the browser vendors, from identity providers, really from a variety of different sectors. And that was the rough consensus of what's the problem we're trying to solve. It's good to actually get that out there so that you can start from, well, what assumption are we making? But with that in mind, there's a couple more things that you need to have in your head as you consider different perspectives of how is this problem impacting different sectors and what is it making organizations do? Because there's an addendum to this, and this one doesn't have consensus, but it is what brings us here today. And that is that applications and services that need to work through a browser for single sign-on, for federated authentication, are indistinguishable from the browser's perspective from trackers. This is an issue. So some things to remember. So the main browser vendors are either very, very big, like Google or Apple, or they're not particularly well funded, like Mozilla. This has implications. It means that their priorities are not always obvious to outsiders. They're not always internally consistent to the very large organization because the left hand in a company the size of Google does not know what the right hand is doing. And it's actually more like an octopus with so many hands moving so many pieces that it's an interesting challenge. And the priorities that they have are often driven by the biggest, or at least the loudest, business interest. Academia is definitely an interest, but it's by no means the biggest one. So another consideration, SAML, which is very important to federated identity in academia, is important. But from the picture of the World Wide Web as a whole, OpenID Connect is so much more prevalent than SAML, to the point that browser vendors, they mostly don't know how SAML works. And they definitely don't know how academia or even the enterprise companies use it, because SAML is very heavily used with companies like Salesforce. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different ways to implement these protocols, and there's no single organization that has the ability to test all the use cases. The browser vendors themselves are still learning about what breaks as they make changes to their products. And yet they have to make changes. They have to be seen to be making progress, because if they don't, they can get in trouble with regulators. Frankly, they get in trouble with regulators anyway, but they're almost in a no-win situation. And yet we in academia have interests that we want to make sure are tested. So a lot of different tensions make this a particularly challenging area. Doing a quick terminology check. There are browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, Brave. But then there are browser engines, the thing that actually support the browser that you see, that you download. There's one called Blink, which you may know as Chromium. There's Gecko, there's WebKit. That's actually kind of an important distinction, because depending on what operating system you're using, your browser might be using a different browser engine. So the behavior for how they handle tracking is actually defined in the browser engine. So Chrome on your desktop uses Chromium. Chrome on your iPad OS or iOS device uses WebKit. So you can't always speak to here's what Chrome does because it depends. And WebKit, which comes out of Apple, is the most restrictive of all the browser engines, which means all browsers on iOS and iPad OS currently don't support third-party cookies. Other browsers like Edge and Chromium, they're built on the same browser engine. So on your desktop, the underlying functionality is largely the same. So just something for you to be aware of. Let's talk for a minute about, well, okay, how does tracking happen at the big web level? So you've got things called third-party cookies. You've got things called bounce tracking. There's IP addresses, browser fingerprinting, and link decoration. So many ways to identify users across the web. So let's start with cookies, because cookies, in a way, are the most tractable of the problems that are causing the hidden tracking of users. So you've got several different kinds of cookies. They're little pieces of blocks of information that's put in a browser for the purpose of, for a variety of purposes, frankly. It enables everything from, okay, this person has authenticated here, so for this session, remember that when they go to different areas of the sites, right? There's also things like this was a choice that they made, make sure that choice is reflected as they go forward. There's also every time a new site is picked up, go report home and say that a user went to the following place. They're all the same. First-party cookies are only accessible by the domain that created it. Those are not under any particular threat. Third-party cookies are cookies, pieces of data that are accessible to any site whatsoever, any domain. And those are the problem. Okay. So bounce tracking. Well, this is also known as redirect tracking. And I'll show you an example of this later on. So these are used by trackers in particular, as on the one hand, to get around the third-party limitations. What they do is they set the piece of information in your browser such that when you go to a site, it redirects you really fast to the tracker location, meaning you've landed there. It's no longer third-party, it's first-party. You visited their site. The page may be completely blank. You won't notice it as a user, but you were there. You're now first-party. The tracker can then say, okay, I now know where they came from, where they're going to, and follow you around the web that way. Not desirable behavior. Oh, but wait. Bounce tracking is also used for very legitimate purposes with OpenID Connect. That's how it validates the session between an identity provider and a relying party in one of the possible flows for how that particular authentication mechanism works. Again, from the browser's perspective, they can't tell the difference. IP addresses. So in academia, this is one of the more common ways for libraries to support authorization to material for their users. From the global perspective, now, and I understand that use case because, you know, okay, you've got 1,000, 5,000, 30,000 students on your campus. You can't identify a single user from the IP addresses for this campus. But from the global perspective, the IP address is considered actually a way that you can track users across a web, because there are far more computers, devices, and whatnot that aren't at a school than are at a school. And so from the browser's perspective, okay, if I track this IP address across the web, I'm probably tracking a user, and I can make certain information about, gather certain information regarding their behavior. That becomes a privacy problem. And the browser vendors have said, well, that's a way that you have hidden tracking, and we're going to figure out how to make that not work. wow, does that have implications for us? But suffice to say, it is a thing, it is a target, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Link decoration. So this, you've all seen link decoration, and I'll show you some examples later. This is when you go to a website, and then usually there's a question mark, and then more information after that. Sometimes it's UTM equals something. Sometimes it's just a gobbledygook. You know, it could be any different things. And this is that gobbledygook, that stuff that's after the question mark, can be perfectly valid query strings. You've gone to a site, you've typed in a search, that changes your browser URL to be the domain and your search terms. Okay. In OpenID Connect, it can be where you have tokens to say, yes, this user has authenticated, they are okay. Perfectly valid. It's also a place to put in tracking information to say, this user is coming from this service to get to your site. You cannot tell the difference from a technical perspective. Browser fingerprinting. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one, but it is another way that is used by trackers to figure out, are we looking at probably the same user going from site to site? Your device, your browser is probably configured in a certain way. So I tend to use Firefox. I tend to have specific themes. I have certain add-ons, and I'm usually coming from my home computer. All of that information pulled together gives me a fingerprint that is remarkably unique on the web. So sites can actually collect that information and say, aha, I now know that this fingerprint is for this entity that's moving across the web, and I can track them. All right, so lots of different ways to track. Some ways are more easily resolved than others. Let's look at what's changing in the next 2 to 3 years. So first, remember, if the feature can be used for tracking, as we've defined earlier, then it's under consideration for a major redesign, for changes in standards, for changes in how the browsers work. They're looking at it to say, what can we do here to prevent this from happening? Third-party cookies, or anything that writes to browser local storage that allows multiple domains to read it. Those are at the top of the list of things to be removed. Again, because it's, in a way, it's the most tractable problem to attack. So let's go on a diet. Who's doing this now? So Safari and the browsers on iPadOS and iOS, third-party cookies are already blocked by default. With Firefox, third-party cookies they do block them, but they support a block list. So Mozilla actually maintains a list of, I think it's roughly about 3,000 domains where they say don't accept third-party cookies from these domains. That's like spam filtering, and that's just a never-ending battle of trying to keep on top of what's the latest domain causing this. Since they're not usually immediately user visible domains, I mean, browsers can just, these kinds of trackers can just register domain after domain after domain after domain. So it's always going to be a game of catch up. Now, you may recall from one of the earlier slides, Firefox is the browser supported by Mozilla, and Mozilla is not nearly as well funded as Apple and Google. So trying to maintain this list is very hard for them. They want to stop. All right, now about Chrome, and this is Chrome on the desktop. They are looking to phase out third-party cookies over a 3-month period, starting in mid-2023. If you have been living in tech news, you will know that this is a delay. They originally had planned to phase out third-party cookies by the, I think it was like January something 2022. And they changed their mind only a couple of weeks ago and saying, all right, we're going to extend that. They probably did that for a variety of reasons. One, they have been hearing loud and clear from groups pulling together about federated identity saying, if you do this, you are our last truly functioning browser that allows federated identity to work as currently designed, and you're not giving us enough time to make changes. Please don't do that. That wouldn't, my own personal opinion is that's probably not compelling enough for an organization the size of Google to change their minds, but it certainly fed into their decision. Another part that fed into their decision was the fact that there are several jurisdictions that are currently investigating them for antitrust behavior, because Google, large organization, many arms, you've got their browser component, but you also have their ad network. They're a huge ad network provider. And if they phase out third-party cookies, which any ad network can use, and then leave something that only works on Chrome browsers that only works for Google, that's monopolistic behavior, and they're not allowed to do that. That's a very bad life choice for them. Whatever changes happen on the web in terms of supporting things like ad networks, it has to ultimately provide the same restrictions and the same functionality for Google as it does for any other ad network. And that's, there's an open question as to how that will actually happen, but it did feed into okay, we don't know how to make this work properly to make everybody happy enough that we don't get sued. So we'll delay and see where we end up. So what breaks when third-party cookies are gone? I mentioned this a little bit. SAML single logout will break, potentially. A lot of it may depend on how a vendor has implemented this. Several OpenID Connect or OAuth, which is what OpenID Connect is based on, several of those features will break, including front channel logout, though there's back channel stuff happening as well, session management, iframe-based session extensions. I mean, a lot of the technical components will break. There are fallback plans, I guess I would say. There's things like back channel work. So it won't be useless, but it will definitely change. And a third thing that will break is identity provider persistence will break, because it will be third-party information in the browser. Anything trying to read the browser local storage to say where was, what IDP did this user choose in the past, that's not going to work quite as intended or as it does today. And that impacts your IDP discovery services and services like seamless access. Okay, so if you want to emulate, if all of this is all well and good, but you really want to see, what exactly breaks, test with Safari. Go ahead and try and use all your platforms, all your services in Safari, and you'll start to see some of the things that don't work. To give you a sense of scale of how are we talking small things? Are we talking big things? Microsoft Teams, it's a very popular collaboration platform. It doesn't work through Safari, just doesn't. And Microsoft knows it, and their response has been, well, stop using Safari, because they cannot make it work in anyone that's going through Safari as opposed to downloading an app. If you want to emulate how Chrome might break if they had gone ahead and turned off support for third-party cookies, you can configure this. Several of you who are much more privacy aware have probably already done this, where you said reject all third-party cookies, and you'll get a sense of what kinds of things break. There's some exceptions of stuff that Google is testing out, things called first-party sets or same-party cookies, partition cookies. There's a lot of like weird little technical gory details that they're messing around with to see, well, if we categorize cookies this way, would that be better? What if we did it that way? Would that be better? So they're figuring it out even as I speak. Okay, so IP addresses. Wait, why is this on the list? You know, why is this in the 2 to 3 year time frame? Primarily because of Apple. At Apple's recent Worldwide Developer conference, they announced that for subscribers to their iCloud Plus service, they're going to automatically start obfuscating, anonymizing the IP address. It'll map to a region, but not their actual location. I think we have to do quite a bit of testing here, but I'm fairly certain this means that sites that depend on IP address authorization will find it no longer works as intended for subscribers of this service. Do you have a lot of subscribers of that service? Probably not right now. But this is, think of this as like the warning shot across the bow. They're testing this out with their premium users. Does it work? Is it received well? Do they get a lot of complaints? If it does what they think it should, which is to prevent tracking and still enable the more common functionality for users, then they're almost certainly going to make this a common feature to their browsers, to all of their services, to their email clients going forward. Okay, but wait, there's more, but not in the 2 to 3 year time frame. This is what they're looking at a little bit more advanced. Now we're talking 5 to 10 years. Bounce tracking. So it's really hard to get an example of bounce tracking that I could actually capture a picture, but I'll give you something, what it kind of looks like. On the, what is that, left of the screen, I did a screenshot of an email message that I received for, I do virtual bike racing of all things. And the domain for the virtual bike racing is called Zwift, Zwift.com. And they said, hey, would you like to sign up for a particular commemorative ride? All right, so you click, if you click on sign up, it's not sending you to Zwift. It's sending you somewhere else. It's sending you through SendGrid. You'll see it flash really quickly in your browser that you've passed through another site before you get to Zwift. It won't show anything on the page, be perfectly blank. You have to be like staring at the URL, the URL bar, before you notice that, oh, you've actually gone through something else. How are they going to fix that? We don't know, but it's on the list of, okay, we know bounce tracking is a problem. We know it enables hidden tracking of users. Therefore, we need to deal with it. Bounce tracking is also very heavily used by federated identity protocols. So whatever happens here could ultimately result in protocol level changes, and those don't happen quickly. So it's on the roadmap. How? Don't know, but it will change. Link decoration. Okay, that's the stuff that's appended to a URL, and I promised you some examples. The first example is very much a tracker. It's basically saying, where are you coming from to get to rollingstone.com? You came from something called Pocket. Now they can actually see that, track that over time. But the next one, met.refeds.org, the question mark entity, that's a search string. That's all that is, and that's perfectly valid. It's not trying to track, it's trying to actually respond to your search query. And the last item, this is an actual, when you go to an identity provider discovery interface, you get all this additional information that's saying, where are you coming from? Where are you going to? You know, so that it can send you to the right place after you've done your authentication. Also says, how long can this cookie live for? So much information in that particular URL that it's kind of important to have in order for this to work, in order for the actual flow to get from the I clicked on sign in to I'm now back at the site after I've logged in that I was trying to get to in the first place. There are a lot of different organizations, there's a lot of different groups that are trying to grapple with the implications of when you make changes to how users are tracked on the web. What does that mean for all the other pieces? So in the Internet Engineering Task Force, that's where the protocol OAuth 2, which underlies OpenID Connect, that's where that's defined. So they're looking at this from their perspective. What do they need to be watching for from a standards question for that specific standard? The OpenID Foundation, which maintains the OpenID Connect standard, they've had a special interest group for browser interaction for quite some time, trying to figure out, well, what does this mean for browsers, largely from an OpenID Connect perspective? The World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, they have a lot of different groups that are looking at this from different perspectives, from different interests. There's the Web Incubator Community Group, the WCG. There's the Privacy Community Group. There's the brand shiny new, and I'll touch on this one in a little bit, the Federated Identity Community Group. But then there's the Web Advertising Business Group, so and you can imagine that the web advertisers might have a slightly different perspective on this than, say, the Federated Identity Community people. A quick note about community groups. Community groups don't set standards, but that is where different entities can come together under a common IPR agreement and say, let's prototype, let's test, let's come up with ideas. And if any of those receive consensus in a community, they can ship them over to a working group and say, could you turn this into a formal standard so that we all can behave in an interoperable way? And then there's groups like In Common, which is the largest, that's the US Identity Federation for Academia. Their technical advisory committee is constantly keeping an eye on the browser space. The RNE Federation community is keeping an eye on this as well. I can speak to both of those because I'm the vice chair for In Common TAC and I'm the co-coordinator for EFET. So by golly, they're going to be kept aware. And there's a lot of discussions that happen as we try and think about what are the implications for our people, for our communities. So would you like to engage in the conversation yourself? You are more than welcome to. If you have any resources that could be used for, down and dirty, deep into code testing, here's a secret for how to engage with organizations like Google. They have a very detailed process of how they test their ideas, and they have they allow anybody to actually participate in that testing to give them feedback with the things that they're prototyping in their browsers. You just have to know that the exact how to do it is out there, and then you have to be able to work with them at that level of rebuilding your own browsers and running through tests and everything. And they will give more weight to active partners in their testing than they would to people just out there saying, hey, but there's a problem. Have you helped us test? We will listen to you more if you've helped us test. This is a way that small sectors like academia can have a much larger impact in how a company like Google performs. So something to think about if you've got any resources that could be assigned to something like that. But if you want to be part of broader conversations and awareness of different proposals, then on the one hand, there's the Privacy Community Group, and there's the shiny new Federated Identity Community Group in the W3C. Community groups are free to join. If you can accept their community contributors license agreement, then you can join. You do not have to pay them money. The purpose of the community contributor license agreement is so that for any ideas discussed in the community group, if any of the entities there actually go and work on that, say, oh, this is a great idea. We're going to take it and see if we can't build it up and work on it in our code. They're allowed to do so. They're not going to be chased after by whoever submitted that to the community group. It becomes, in a way, you know, a common space for us to be able to work on things together, to prototype things, to fail fast if we have to, you know, but to be fairly flexible while still knowing you're not going to get sued for playing with someone else's idea. It's not all about writing code, mind you. There's also just general principles discussed there. So something to think about. So that was a lot, I know. And there is light down there at the end of the tunnel, whether it's a train, whether we're coming out of the tunnel, that's sort of an open question, I think. And all of this information that I've shared with you today, a lot of it is probably going to be stale within 2-3 months. So this is a space that you do have to keep your finger on, because it's going to change as fast as it can change. And I will be happy to continue to work with STM and several other groups to try and keep you as informed about those changes as possible. With that, if folks have any questions, I would be happy to take them. Usually Zoom has a raise hand feature, though I don't know if this one does. Let's see. Yes, down at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. If you click on that, you can raise your hand. And then given that we have about 40 people here, that's probably the most efficient way to not collide when there's questions to be asked. So please, any questions? Not one? Ah, Lisa. Come on up, there you go.
You know me, Heather, I always have questions. So
I was hoping, I was feeling a little anxious there.
Yeah, let's maybe kick us off a little bit. It strikes me that much of what you said today is, you know, obviously this is aimed at sort of alerting people in the publishing community from STM, but as a librarian, I think, wow, I haven't heard this discussed at all in my community. And I'm wondering, what of this would you say a librarian kind of, there's the technical side of it, right? A lot of it, but the user services side of it, what of these things could already be affecting our users that we need to be thinking about, because we are often the frontline troubleshooters. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking like, okay, if somebody's enrolled in that Apple program, this could, you know, they could be calling us saying, I can't get access, not realizing, although if they have that, they probably do realize, but you never know, like people just disconnect, right? Like they don't necessarily realize that was how that access was being enabled. So on a like 2-day basis, what could be messing with users' access?
So the absolute first thing, if I was, you know, frontline at the library help desk and people were calling in going, this isn't working, first thing I would say is, what's your operating system and what browser are you using? That would be the very, very, very sure. First thing. Because and unfortunately, the answer after that would be, okay, if you are on Mac OS using Safari, try using Chrome and see if it works. If they are using, you know, their iPad as their primary device or their phone as their primary device, then it gets a little trickier. And I really don't know what to suggest in those cases other than awareness that you're going to start seeing unexpected failure patterns.
Mm-hmm. And do you see these things as probably impacting learning management systems as well as content?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There will, everything I talked about today, it was, you're right, geared primarily towards publishers because STM presentation.
Yeah, of course.
But it applies to anything that's using federated authentication, anything at all, and how it's doing that. One of the biggest challenges that we have had, putting really quick my INCOM and technical advisory committee hat on, is we've talked regularly about just how hard it is to get service providers to join a federation, because everybody has implemented the protocols slightly differently. Sometimes they're doing things that aren't exactly in the protocol spec, where they've started setting cookies or done things that the protocol doesn't say you need to do, but they did it for whatever reason. And that leaves us with an enormous amount of uncertainty of, okay, we know you're using SAML, or we know you're using OpenID Connect to authenticate users. That's great. What else did you do?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I just say is it's important, I think, to remember that publishers are actually sometimes providing a learning management system if they're a textbook publisher. So, but I'm also thinking about the fact that for a lot of courses, the actual delivery of content is through the LMS. And so you've kind of got layer upon layer of sort of like, oh, wait, did the LMS, like, you can't, like, I don't know, my brain is just kind of going, but I appreciate the sort of like heads up on, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, it's not a great response for people who don't have other devices, but it sounds like the iPad, iPhone is, do you have another device?
Pretty much.
Is at least the first, but it looks like I managed to talk long enough to get you other questions, at least in the chat. So I'm going to now listen in, and I see there's some other hands. So thanks. This was really super informative. Thanks to STM for hosting it.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll grab the one in the chat and then I'll get to Dan. So Tamsin asks, do you think academia needs their own identity access and authentication protocols? And do we rely too much on the commercial sector? So I think it was at this point 3 or 4 years ago when this became a glint in the eye of refeds, where we were starting to see these kinds of conversations happening. Someone said, it's not that we need our own protocols, it's that we need our own browser. We need a browser that behaves the way we want a browser to behave. And so that was the idea that we toyed with a little bit of, do we just need our own browser? The idea didn't go very far, because doing that, that's not a small lift from a technical perspective. Actually making that happen, supporting such a thing, and then trying to figure out, well, if you build a browser that enables this kind of functionality for academia, why would I, as an end user, say, oh, I'm a student and I'm going to be using this browser to access my scholarly material, but I'm going to go to that browser so that I can get to Amazon to buy, rent a textbook. Wait, no, why would you switch browsers back and forth for your behavior? It's not something they'd be likely to do. So we do rely on the commercial sector an enormous amount, because they have the resources to make broad brush things happen, like browsers, like attending these standards meetings where the protocols are defined. That's not inexpensive. And so we have to let them do that, and then find ways to make sure that we're heard in terms of our requirements. Dan. You're on mute.
Thank you. Great topic, and I always love this one. So I'm going to come at this a little bit from the security side and say, is this yet another opportunity for the libraries, for people who are publishing, to come back to the security organizations that they work with and say, we have a common problem. How can we work through this together? Because I think these are probably the two areas that have the biggest visibility into the use of this kind of technology broadly and across other areas. I guess, do you see there being value in having that kind of additional relationship? And the other one is, how bad is it going to be for those depending upon IP address authentication come September, when all those Mac OSs start using VPNs, the default built-in, the private relays? Right.
Okay. First question. Yeah. And then I'll get to the second one. So with the first question, I presented at a UKSG webinar yesterday, and one of the topics that came up had me put on my, if I were queen of the universe and I could say this would help so much and you should just do it, it would be, if your campus, if your organization doesn't have an identity and access management governance committee, it really should. It really should. And the librarians should be on it. The security department should be on it. The provost should be on it. The CIO should be on it. right? That you, because there are a lot of interests on campus that are all going to be impacted by this, slightly different ways. But if you can come together such that you're not surprised by changes that might be done unto you because another group like the security department said, oh, this isn't going to work for us, let's just turn this right off. You have an opportunity to be a part of a part of the solution as opposed to being surprised. Talk to your CIOs. If you don't have this kind of thing, say that you should, and be a part of spinning it up. And you may learn that something already exists. And if you're not already part of it, you say, I want to be at that table. For your second question about the VPNs, I really want someone to test that because I haven't had an opportunity to try it out to see if it will break the way I think it probably will. Thinking through how networks function and what IP addresses actually do, I struggle to imagine that the whole new VPN thing isn't going to break IP authorization models on campus. I can't see how it wouldn't. Maybe they're doing some kind of magic in the back, but
yeah, I've been playing with more consumer systems, and it's been very clearly changing how IP addresses are used and where I'm coming from. So it feels like this may be the last gasp of IP address because of the prevalence of Apple products, and I don't know whether or not others will follow this.
Yeah, it is a big area of concern, and I'm really worried that in a way, as Lisa said, librarians are going to be so surprised. So surprised. All right, other questions?
Since you're not calling on me, Heather, I'll just chime in.
Oh, you didn't see your hand up.
Oh, no worries. So I just wanted to share with the group that I recently did an analysis of traffic of users hitting the ACS site to see if the impact on seamless access on that persistence layer, because as Heather's described, all the Apple products and Safari browsers are starting to firewall that persistence layer so that users can't, you can't share that identity protection across publishers. I found about 81 to 82% of our users is my estimate that still would have full seamless access persistence capabilities hitting our site. So that gives you a sense of, it's starting to make an impact. And I think the behavior that users would see if they are relying on seamless access to log into publisher sites, the behavior would be that their persistence would be only to the publisher where they actually do the IDP discovery and set the institutional preference. So if a user is on the ACS site and searches for their institution, it would stick, for the ACS site. But then they go to Wiley or Springer Nature, it would be a fresh start again. And so they would have to search again for their institution, and then it would stick on that site. So think of like compartmentalized, persistence is how it would be working today. So just wanted to let everyone know that's my estimate on current impact. The other thing I think is worthwhile noting, Heather, is that your comments about the use of SAML made it sound like SAML is predominantly used by global higher ed. And yeah, it is used by global higher ed, but it's also heavily used by corporations. SAML is also heavily used by the US federal government as well. Others would probably know more about that than I, but I think it's actually SAML is the preferred protocol for the US federal government for single sign-on. So it's a big deal, not just for higher ed, but much broader than that as well.
Absolutely. I think the big difference is how the actual federations form. In the enterprise world, and I'm going to pick on Salesforce for a minute. They very heavily use SAML with their customers, but it's all one-to-one agreements. They don't have they're not in a federation where they've got a third party hosting all the metadata for all the different interactions, and they can trust each other that way, right? It's all handled one to one to one to one to one. The U.S. government, bless their hearts, they are a fascinating piece of this puzzle, because for whatever reason, I have never seen them engage in this conversation, you know, trying to reach out to members of the government to say, you know, can you say something here? But for reasons, I guess they can't accept the community contributor license agreement or something. They are a black hole in terms of what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, what plans they have. And it's somewhat terrifying, because, you know, they hold on to technology for a really long time. They still have requirements for Internet Explorer. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. So there's a couple more questions in the chat. Will waveless URLs still work for direct linking? Honestly, I don't know, because I don't understand how waveless URLs work. So my answer to that would be test it. Ralph,
I'd say probably, but they use link decoration, so it may not, you know, from that perspective.
So it'll work for now, it'll work for the next few years, but I guess that's another point I would want to make is there's the more prevalent technology becomes, the greater the weight of the expense of how hard it is to change that technology, where it just accretes into this bigger ball of stuff that you keep trying to move ahead. And that's why, you know, when Google said we're pushing this out 2 years, I was so grateful, because it's going to take that long to decide what's a viable alternative to just the cookie problem, and to get all the different entities that currently depend on that particular cookie behavior to adapt to a new reality. Honestly, I'm not sure it can be done in 2 years. This is more like a 5-year problem. The bigger issues of bounce redirects and link decoration and whatnot, that's even harder. So paying attention now, so that you don't have to be at the end of it when it's too late to make any influence any changes, is incredibly important. So it may seem far away, but in the standards development world, it's right next door. Okay, let's see. Could Seamless Access create a browser plugin that goes around the problem? Well, so one of the things that to think about with Seamless Access is there's 3 different ways that you could actually integrate the Seamless Access services with your site, right? There's advanced integration, there's standard integration, there's limited integration. The big difference between these is the fact that Seamless Access consists of 3 separable components. There's the button that, you know, starts with access through your institution. There's the persistent service that stores something in browser local storage, and there's the IDP discovery service, right? Advanced integrators really focus on that persistent service, and may or may not use the code for the button. They may write their own code for the button, just make it look the same. Those are the ones that I'd worry about most. Standard integration involves a lot more taking the user to Seamless Access. And if they do that, then when Seamless Access queries what does Seamless Access have in Seamless Access's section of browser local storage, that's going to work, because that's same origin. It's no longer a cross-origin action. It's all the same thing. And limited is the same way. So I don't know that a plugin would work, but if we can improve the functionality and flexibility of a standard implementation such that even the advanced folks would be able to use it to best effect, that could be a mitigation for some of what we see. Let's see. Okay, and Lisa points out some of the problems with access broker plugins. Yep. Okay, we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any other questions? Dan, I'm assuming that's an old hand. Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right, then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you very much for your time, your attention, for listening to me talk about one of my favorite and most terrifying topics. And I do hope to see you all again when we do another update on this, probably in a few months. So